Hey there everyone, Ramesh here, back again with another video. In this video we are going to discuss one of the important interview question: why choose Spring Boot over Spring? Well, before understanding why choose Spring Boot over Spring, let's quickly recap what Spring Framework and what Spring Boot is. Well, Spring is a comprehensive framework for building Java-based enterprise applications. It provides solutions for enterprise features like dependency injection, aspect-oriented programming, transaction management, and more. So Spring's flexibility allows developers to build web applications, microservices, or any kind of Java-based software. However, with all this flexibility comes complexity. Setting up Spring-based project often requires a lot of configuration, which can be time-consuming and error-prone. Now let us see what is Spring Boot. Spring Boot is built on top of Spring Framework. It simplifies the process of building Spring-based applications by providing auto-configuration, embedded web servers, and starter dependencies, which reduce the amount of configuration required. Spring Boot takes away much of the complexity involved in setting up Spring-based applications and helps developers get projects up and running quickly. Now let us dive into why choose Spring Boot over a Spring. The first reason is less configuration. Well, one of the biggest pain points with a Spring is the amount of manual configuration needed to set up a project. You often need to write a large amount of XML or Java-based configuration to wire the beans, inject the beans, manage dependencies, and set up your application. So this makes projects difficult to manage, especially for beginners, right? Spring Boot eliminates most of this configuration by using auto configuration. So based on the dependencies you add to your project, Spring Boot automatically sets up the required configuration. For example, if you add a database dependency, Spring Boot configures the database connection for you. This saves your time and makes the development process much smoother. Alright, so basically Spring Boot reduces a lot of manual configuration that is required to set up in a Spring-based applications. The second reason why to choose Spring Boot over Spring is that of embedded web servers. In traditional Spring, setting up a web application requires you to configure an external web server like Tomcat or Jetty. You need to install and configure the server, and then you need to deploy your application as a WAR file. So there are a lot of steps required in order to deploy a simple traditional Spring web application into a Tomcat web server, right? So first you need to download the Tomcat server. Next you need to install that web server, and then you need to build the WAR file out of a web application, and then you need to deploy that WAR file into an external web server. So there are a lot of steps, right? But with a Spring Boot, embedded web servers comes built in. You can run your application with the embedded servers like Tomcat or Jetty out of the box. Well, Spring Boot provides an embedded server that you can use to quickly deploy your application. Okay, this means you don't have to configure an external server. You can run your application as a jar file. So this is particularly useful for developers building microservices or a lightweight applications. Alright, so Spring Boot comes with embedded servers, so you can quickly deploy your Spring Boot application as a jar file. The third reason why to choose Spring Boot over Spring is that starter dependencies. Well, managing dependencies in a traditional Spring can be overwhelming, as you have to manually include each library and its transitive dependencies. This requires careful management to ensure compatibility between libraries and versions. But Spring Boot introduces starter dependencies, which are predefined setup libraries that are commonly used together. For example, Spring Boot starter web dependency includes everything you need to build a web application, such as Spring MUC, embedded Tomcat server, logging libraries, and JSON libraries, and all those stuff. So using starter dependency, you can reduce the complexity by bundling commonly used libraries. It helps avoid version complexity and missing dependencies. It helps make it easy to add functionality without worrying about individual libraries. Alright, so Spring Boot provides a lot of starter dependencies that we can use to get a set of all the commonly used libraries, and it also manages the versions of all those libraries. The fourth reason why to choose Spring Boot over Spring is that rapid development. When you are developing with Spring, setting up a new project can take a time due to the amount of configuration involved. Additionally, manually setting up the development environment and deploying the application can be slow. So Spring Boot solves this problem. Like Spring Boot speed up the development process significantly. With the tools like Spring Initializer, you can generate a new Spring Boot project in a minutes. You can run your Spring Boot application directly from the IDE thanks to the embedded server, making the development cycle faster. The fifth reason why to choose Spring Boot over Spring is that microservices support. As the world moves towards a microservice architecture, Spring Boot has become the go-to framework for building small independent services that communicate with each other. So microservices require a lightweight modular application that can be deployed, developed and scaled independently. While you can technically build microservices with traditional Spring, Spring Boot is especially designed to make microservices easier to develop and deploy. The sixth reason why to choose Spring Boot over Spring is that Spring Boot provides production-ready features. Well, Spring Boot includes production-ready features out of the box, making it easy to deploy and manage applications in a live environment. The seventh reason why to choose Spring Boot over Spring is that Spring Boot is easier integration with cloud services. Well, Spring Boot works well with the cloud platforms like AWS, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure. Using Spring Cloud alongside Spring Boot allows developers to build cloud-native applications that can easily scale and manage microservices architecture. Additionally, Spring Boot's integration with container technologies like Docker and Kubernetes make it powerful option for cloud-native applications. So developers can package Spring Boot applications in a containers and deploy them to cloud environments with ease. So these are the reasons why we choose Spring Boot over a Spring framework.